What is this about, Sturgis? Tabitha dropped back as the two wizards swept into the office like two overgrown ravens wearing the magical community's color of choice for after dark. She looked after them as her cousin looked with mild interest around the office. Snape on the other hand strode over to her desk and perused with undisguised contempt the contents of her desk. "Excuse me," she exclaimed as Snape picked up the book that Sturgis had sent to her. Tabitha recognized that look and wasn't going to put up with it in her office. "Put that down, will you? What are you doing here, anyway?" She looked from Snape to Sturgis. Her cousin's expression changed from absent thoughts to the here and now as Tabitha brought him back to the present. "When that idiot house elf woke me up to tell me that you were in mortal danger, I naturally assumed this was the case." Snape looked up from the green-covered tome and placed it back on her desk. "As it was mistaken, having confused you with the previous occupant of your room, Merlin knows how. Nevertheless," he looked across to Sturgis Podmore, breaking off sharply. "And that gives you the right to come here to find me? I'll have you know I work for Dash." "You want to know about the Universal Link?" growled Snape dangerously. "You have been sent to Hogwarts to discover this?" Tabitha nodded dumbly. "Then listen, and the information that we seek may suit all of our needs." He picked up the green-bound book from her desk and strode towards her, waving it in her direction menacingly. "Do you think this came to you by accident? Do you even know what this is?" Tabitha continued to stare at it as both it and Snape advanced quickly before shaking her head slowly. "Only a book of children's stories, wizard ones, not mole ones," she added unnecessarily. "What has this to do with the Universal Link and Cecilia Frobisher?" "Sturgis?" Tabitha turned to look at her cousin, who returned her questioning expression with one of gravity. "It is not unlike the one that was used to determine the Universal Link," he began slowly, "but it is not identical. The mole Cecilia Frobisher used such a book to formulate it. Now she is missing and in hiding, we no longer have it." "But," began Tabitha, her mind flitting to the letter that she had found in Snape's drawer waiting for her only to unravel it further to find the location of Cecilia Frobisher, but she bit back her sentence and fell silent. "We do not have the link intact," replied Snape, handing her Mysterious Mythology. "However, you could rediscover it. Being a Mysteria, you have the ability." Tabitha looked at the book and then back at Snape, swelling anger beginning to overcome her. He was mocking her and her profession. How dare he? "And you think I could do something with a storybook? You think I'm falling for this?" She turned to her cousin again and advanced on him. "Sturgis, whatever this is about, speak plainly. I don't understand why it is you're in my office at this time of the morning." Despite her annoyance, Sturgis Podmore smiled back. He knew his cousin and how sensitive she was about her work and placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. "It is why you are in your office at this time of the morning that we are concerned about, Tabs," he replied softly, watching her blush a little in his use of her nickname. "Don't answer just yet, wait till I've finished. There is no wrong answer to any of this. You went to Hogwarts because Umbridge made you?" Tabitha felt herself nodding slightly. "And she has compelled you to find out about the Universal Link? And teach, which you hate. And you'd like nothing more than to be back here with your work and think nothing of what you've been forced to do?" Tabitha felt her shoulders sag. How well her cousin knew her, more so than her brother Robert. She looked back at Sturgis, who was nodding too, and she smiled at him in retaliation to the glare she could feel behind her courtesy of her colleague. "How then would you feel about an exchange? Information for information? You can give Umbridge all she needs until there is no more need for her to know it in exchange for your help." Tabitha paused as her cousin continued to talk to her softly. What did he mean? The telling of Ministry secrets? To Severus Snape? Whose side are you on? From behind her, Snape intoned the words like splintering wood, each syllable bouncing off Tabitha as if it were mere shards. She looked at him in surprise. "Are you, as a Mulborn, on the side of the Ministry, and its security measures? Or do you care about Dash?" "You are asking me to tell you Ministry secrets?" blurted out Tabitha hotly. "Because I can assure you, I will not." "Is this worth it? All this security? All you're doing for Dolores Umbridge?" Handed her over all the information she needs. Tabitha turned to the smoldering fire that was Snape, a pile that was sure to erupt in the anger and fury that he directed on occasions towards his students. She really didn't want to be in the way. But then, she didn't have to explain herself. "What do you want?" she repeated again, looking back at her cousin, whose short wispy beard was twitching sporadically and whose eyebrows were raised in surprise at her tone. "Your help." It was not Sturgis who spoke those words but Snape. Gone was the potential blaze, replaced instead with glacier-like stillness. "Your help," echoed Sturgis, stepping towards Tabitha. "Share what you know and you will be doing a great service to our world. Our world to be safe, the security acts have seen to that. And I'm not 12, nor 22 again either," she added silently. "You're scared," he said softly. "You wouldn't be here if you weren't. Many others are scared. Children who have lost parents. Wives who have lost husbands. Husbands who have lost families. All to the wretched security acts. And you have an alternative? Or a shadow of one? A myth perpetuated by Dumbledore so he can undermine the Ministry? I have been where no one has gone before," Tabitha declared, looking between both trespasser wizards. "I have seen what only a mere handful has seen. And you have the dot there." She stopped, mainly because she couldn't think of appropriate adjectives to describe how she felt at their audacity. "No," she replied decisively, folding her arms so the sleeves of her robe stuck out wildly. "This isn't anything to do with me. I'm here to do this job, and do it I will." And there the conversation would have ended. Should have ended. Sturgis Podmore and Severus Snape should have taken her at her word and accepted it, leaving the office and leaving her alone. They should have left her to continue the discovery of the universal link while she dreamed about solving mysteries. They should not have sent her a book of children's stories claiming it was going to help her understand the Mole-Wizard connection. She faced Voldemort for something that wasn't her fight, Tabs. Instead of leaving with Snape, Sturgis spoke these words to his cousin, resurrecting their conversation by his accountant-like meticulousness. "What?" She faced Voldemort. Snape repeated the most important words in Sturgis's sentence. "Yes," replied Tabitha stiffly. "I know." "By she, Cecilia Frobisher, you mean? Dumbledore said so at trial. I saw her, Tabs, with my own eyes. She stood in front of Voldemort even when she was suffering and dying. She is out there still, doing all she can, but he needn't have done that. She gave it all she had. Tabitha stopped in her act of dismissing Snape. She might be caught up in disbelief because of Dolores Umbridge, but she didn't doubt Sturgis. Then she was foolish. Your beloved Mole, Snape snorted as he paced back towards her desk. What? He looked up from the copy of Mysterious Mythology and narrowed his eyes. Whereas you hide yourself away in here, delusions of credibility abounding and do heaven knows what with a load of old dash. Mysteries, interjected Tabitha quickly. Interpreting mysteries for the good of all wizards. And had it not been for Dumbledore's secret society, you are here for them, from them, aren't you? I would not be compelled to remain at Hogwarts and I would be here, with them. There might be things I can't do, Severus Snape, but there are plenty of things I can do that other wizards can't. Not even your precious Mole. She put her hands on her hips in defiance, the change in stance doing nothing to aid the graceful hang of her robe. Then prove it. Help us, declared Snape, banging his fist on the desk and making the letter that had come with the parcel that had been the book flutter gracefully to the red-tiled floor. By doing what? She asked, a slight tone of mocking in her voice. Describe to us. Make us understand. What is being a Mysteria like? Tabitha turned to the questioner. Had it been Snape then that would have been the end. Instead her cousin spoke to her using the same tone of voice he had used when he came to see her at Hogwarts. When she had been lost and confused. When he had comforted her. When she was getting nowhere in the Mole world. When he had been on the Flu Network to tell her of a job at the Ministry. Her wonderful cousin Sturgis, who had been there for her when no one else had. Tabitha exhaled, considering how to frame her next few sentences. What's it like? Being a Mysteria. It's like a double-edged sword. There's always something different about us. Vincento says it's our gift. He's been doing it far longer than I have, though. And how do you do it? Intoned Snape, stonily. Tabitha said nothing, merely staring back at him silently. Show us what you did, all of those things that you have done. He demanded. In response Tabitha continued to say nothing. In despair Snape looked at Sturgis Podmore. Please will you answer Severus, Tabs? Why? She shot back. He's not helped me, Sturgis. He's... Tabitha felt herself shaking with annoyance under his gaze, but more so because she couldn't exactly say what he'd done. It didn't matter. It was her realm and she was damned if they thought she was just going to roll over like a puppy and tell them anything they wanted to know. A teacher. I'm not. Learning is what you do when you've forgotten everything you were taught at school. It's no wonder you have such horrible students that you do, Severus Snape, she added with bitterness. And instead you prefer to solve mysteries. It wasn't a barb. His words had no malice in them. Snape simply made a statement of fact. I have solved many, replied Tabitha, a touch of pride injected into the plainly returned statement. How? I'm afraid I can't tell you that. She walked towards Snape and then past him, her flat shoes squeaking a little on the tiles, and pointed to a ministerial certificate that hung next to her desk, her name picked out in Gothic script. This is where my allegiance lies. She jumped as Snape banged his hand on the desk again, but her cousin moving towards her calmed her now quickening pulse. I can understand why having your induction certificate means so much, he conceded, shooting a let me handle it look at the ashen-faced Snape. I can understand where you feel your loyalties lie, and you don't have to give us the details. What we need is for you to tell us how you do it. What in you makes you a Mysteria and, say, me not? What do you do? Tabitha hesitated. She could quite happily tell her cousin everything he wanted to know, without having to know why or even care. She would quite happily have told him of all of the mysteries and not have played the loyalty to the Ministry card. But she knew that it wasn't him that wanted it, she knew it was Snape. Whatever Snape wanted to do with the knowledge of being a Mysteria, a large part of her wanted to keep it from him. But then, he wouldn't have come all the way from Hogwarts with Sturgis to find her if her work wasn't important. How important? Tabitha asked, looking at Severus Snape. I know it's you who wants the information, not Sturgis, and I know you ordinarily wouldn't give two owl hoots for me. I just need to know The whole of our world could depend on what you tell us now. The words hung in the space between them like icicles on a washing line. Tabitha shuddered. And why do you so badly want it? This world-changing information? You have to search for me at my place of work? How relevant would the information of a barely proficient, inadequate witch be who is also a mad Mysteria? Tabs, said Sturgis soothingly. The information is vital if we are to put up any defense against Lord Voldemort. Surely you can understand that? The security measures that have been put in place by the Ministry will be like paper to any attack that is planned. What your cousin fails to realize, Podmore, is that the information she possesses is entirely relevant. Snape passed between Sturgis and Tabitha and stood between them menacingly. I talk of course about the veil. The memory graveyard that your department cracked. There. We know about one of the mysteries already, so now all you need to do is dash. That I cracked, Tabitha replied, an air of farawayness in her voice. What? I cracked the mystery of the veil, she repeated serenely, before looking at Snape triumphantly. You? But you're... I'm not an unspeakable, no. Those clowns to do day-to-day things. All showy and false. No. I'm a Mysteria. A specialist. The mysteries choose you, you see, she commented matter-of-factly. Oh, on the surface I might be useless at exams, and everything else both wizardly and mullish in this world, but I'm a Mysteria. I solve mysteries, and eventually I would have solved the one that your mole friend solved before. So brave. The mysteries choose you. And you solved the mystery of the veil. How? Snape interjected, staring at Tabitha and eyeing her closely. So you want to know what's beyond the veil? She replied. Why should I tell you? What's in it for me, Sturgis, if you don't mind me asking? She leaned past Snape and looked at her cousin. Tabitha. Well, it's either you tell me or Voldemort will be using it to mount his attack, replied Snape revealingly. Tabitha shot him a look of concern. The veil? He plans to use the veil? Snape nodded. Then you'll need help to understand it, Severus Snape, she replied, taking a few steps to the door that led to beyond. I can't show you here, I have to channel it when I get to it. Her determined expression changed to one of uncertainty and she whispered, but Dolores. Umbridge. You're so scared of her, aren't you? Growled Snape. No. She bosses you and you just let her, Tabitha. Her cousin smiled comfortingly at her and Tabitha felt her face go red, and felt a switch flick in her head. So you've discovered it, and you know that's where memories are kept? Those of the dead. Those that the befuddlers take, concluded Tabitha. You need to know nothing more and you don't need to be here anymore. She folded her arms and looked defiantly at Snape. Here's a hypothesis, continued Snape, ignoring her. Suppose you were killed, in the early 80s by a crony of Voldemort and you are discovered by the Ministry. Before the funeral, what happens to the memories? They are stored. Beyond the veil. Whispered Tabitha, shuddering. How do you know this? Because I was there the night Regulus Black was murdered, said Snape. It could have been me, carrying out orders at a whim of a mad wizard. It is the storage of his memories intact which are the very weapon, through a Mysteria, which Voldemort hopes to utilize to his own ends. He shone beady black eyes at Tabitha, who felt herself shudder, and she looked at Sturgis. You're not suggesting that you could aid the Order of the Phoenix, Tabitha, and help us. Help us win the fight. He murders moles, people like our family, Tabs. Without even thinking about it. He murders people like our family, Tabitha echoed. Chance would be a fine thing. She frowned and scolded herself for thinking such a terrible thing. You could help, repeated Snape stonily. Yes, thought Tabitha, I could. But she folded her arms and looked away. No. You don't want this to happen, Miss Penright, surely? Said Snape. Tabitha frowned. In the same way that I will not be coerced to assist dark wizards, I will not be assisting any rebel movements. I understand, said Snape. I am a Mysteria and take my job seriously. He said nothing and Sturgis took a step forward. If Umbridge is discredited, Tabitha, she will no longer be your boss. She won't be able to order you around anymore. She won't be able to make you go back to Hogwarts, and you'll be able to go back to your mystery and solve it. To go back to the old way of working, sighed Tabitha dreamily, without the time regulations and the regimentation. To investigate in the way we should. To work organically, like we always did. Kingsley Shacklebolt will replace her. He'll allow you to work in whichever way you choose. Tabitha smiled and nodded decisively. I'll get you the information you need. If you can help me, Severus Snape. 88,888,888. What actually is a Mysteria? Thus far you have heard the definition in various forms from one of the main characters of this story. There probably isn't a Mul equivalent for a Mysteria in the same way that there isn't the need for car mechanics in the wizard world. Similar to how mechanics can tell the problem and know by a kind of intuition how to solve the problem and the one that was going to occur in 30,000 miles time, a Mysteria uses their instinct to get to the bottom of and understand incredibly tricky metaphysical magic. The position of Mysteria evolved from the need to not just store away highly magical, and highly dangerous, artifacts but also to interpret what they mean so that their owners or originators could be killed. Imprisoned for life in Azkaban. Imprisoned for life in Azkaban before being killed, which is essentially the same as a. Many wizards were employed to get rid of the backlog of dodgy and otherwise dubious objects, many of them yielding easily to some of the simpler spells, but it was the ones that refused to give up their enigmatic presence that eventually required specialist help. From a couple of dozen unspeakables, so called because that was what a lifetime of mystery breaking left the average wizard who worked there, an elite 2 or 3 were chosen to work on the most difficult of artifacts. No one, least of all Mysterias themselves, knew how they did it. Traditionally they kept themselves to themselves, as they were, to put it kindly, a little on the weird side. As we have found out through Tabitha Penwright, it is the weirdness and off-the-wall approach that goes the furthest to solve the unsolvable. Few wizards knew about them and fewer still understood them. They were one of the oddballs of the Ministry for Magic. However, it is their strangeness and unusual approach that is now not going to condemn them but allow them to be pardoned, celebrated even, as Tabitha Penwright prepared to explain everything to Severus Snape. 88,888,888. Prophecies, that's Vincento. Tabitha pointed from the main corridor beyond the door from her office and gestured quickly to her right, to a small branched passage similar to the one where her mystery stood further up and to the left. It opened out into the dimensionless void in which the globular prophecies shimmered and sparkled. The Mysteria paused in her transit from one end of the corridor to the other and listened for the faint ululation of what always sounded to Tabitha like disembodied voices. So it is possible for someone to know all about this stuff and still remain sane? Tabitha shot a look at Snape, whose unsneering told her he was not asking her out of malice. Nevertheless she chose to ignore it and continued to walk in the direction of the veil. To be able to understand more than one thing at once takes a certain mind, wouldn't you agree? She asked at length. It is just for the unique approach we take you need a unique mind. It was a tragedy that we were all caught up with the paperwork from the last battle with Voldemort, or I would have been able to continue with my interpretation. And where do you stand on all of this? Miss Tabitha Penwright, Mysteria. This time it looked as if Snape was sneering. Tabitha eyed him carefully, watching his mouth curl at the corners. They neared the back wall of the room of artifacts and Tabitha turned, facing the tall veiled archway. She sighed and stepped her right foot forward. With able synchronicity Snape stepped into her rhythm. Well, like everyone really, she replied, playing it safe. I want to see him dead as much as the next wizard, gone and finished. But the information is hard to keep, prompted Snape as they bore down on the archway. Did you even consider that the Dark Lord might have other weapons of choice? Like what? Well, Mul weapons would be ideal for killing wizards if by chance wizards were incapacitated. A physical breach of the body, for example, a gun or a knife, he added. Just as it would for a Mul, replied Tabitha swiftly. Well, actually, no. If the right spell was performed that suspended the wizard from his powers, then almost certainly kill, especially as they are not as likely to respond to them. Muls know to move out of the way. They are used to their normal dangers. We, on the other hand, are not, and this is where the problems lie. He stopped walking when Tabitha did and he watched her intently. She was staring at a point about 8 inches away, concentrating hard before turning to look at Snape slowly. "Theoretically speaking," replied Tabitha slowly, "that would make sense. It is, however, impossible to know unless a wizard had opted for mullness. It is a good theory though." "It is thanks to Cecilia Frobisher," continued Snape, recommencing his gait as Tabitha began to walk again. "Were it not for her perseverance and her establishment of the connection. Raymond Lully was the start of it. He found it, and because of Voldemort he died, and his secret would have been lost forever. To you, as someone who solves mysteries, I know you won't be able to let this go." He handed her the book that had arrived by post earlier that early morning and paused as she stopped again. "There's not much I'll be able to do with this. I'll try everything I know, of course. Dolores said there is a great mystery that has been solved already but then lost. I would give anything to know what it was." "And the veil?" They began to walk again, and the archway ahead of them began to loom loftily. Tabitha said nothing for a moment as she left Snape standing at its front as she walked round it purposefully. Eventually she answered the wizard's question. "The veil." Standing next to Snape again, she held out her hand unnecessarily as a kind of introduction to the inanimate object. "The veil. It kills people. Kills wizards." "How? Why? Why does it kill us?" "I have no idea," replied Tabitha, completing her circuit. She grabbed Snape's arm as he took another step towards it, leaning forward, but Tabitha put her hand on his chest. "No." Snape looked at Tabitha, his eyes like gimlets. "Be careful. It's alluring, and it's deadly." "But you—" He stared at Tabitha. "And you agreed. "I know. You need to see these first," she replied firmly. "We'll return." Tabitha led the way past the veiled archway and on into another corridor, lower vaulted and more cavernous than the first. Ahead of them ethereal glows were picked out on either side of the wall, and, as they neared, their grisly identity became apparent. "Unspeakables work on these, that I know," said Snape at length as he examined one or two of the exhibits. "What are they?" Tabitha walked ahead, touching her palm close to one of the many thousands of jelly-coated brains whose glow pulsed mysteriously. "A storehouse," she began, turning and smiling faintly at Snape, who put his hand near one too. Disappointment flickered across his face for a brief moment as the brain he had chosen did not glow as Tabitha's had done. She smiled to herself before continuing her explanation as Snape dropped his hand, annoyed. "They are the power for the veil, or rather, what's behind it. The memories could not just exist beyond the veil on their own, and so, when very powerful wizards came to die, many of them decided that they wanted to find a way to store their magical learning and experience. They came up with the veil, others of which exist throughout the world though in different forms. At the start they had to use their actual brains, but the unspeakables working there at the time came up with a new method of storing the memories of wizards of note without the necessity of keeping their brains, but they kept the magical power storage brain-shaped." Tabitha snorted mirthfully before adding, "That's unspeakables for you." She looked back down the corridor where the archway and veil were a mere few inches high now. "Knowing that made my interpretation of my artifact much easier, I can tell you." She dropped her hand and fell silent. "You'd choose to do this? This type of work?" Snape's tone expressed his incredulity. "Why?" "It's an honor," replied Tabitha, her voice becoming distant and far away. "All mysteries are an honor. To have the ability to interpret things usually hidden to everyone else." She looked at Snape suddenly. "Surely you understand this well, seeing as you and Mrs. Frobisher discovered something hidden?" She folded her arms. In return, Snape's fists rested on his hips. "So why come to Hogwarts?" he replied, returning her question unanswered and delivering her a question of his own. "The place needed filling," Tabitha replied plainly. "My work over. I was spare," she added a touch bitterly. "And the ministry you claim to honor and respect, they didn't respect you," he replied, his voice returning to the mocking tone to which Tabitha was used. They don't even respect wizards. You mean the security laws? Tabitha watched Snape nod. Everything had been tightened by law for the good of things. It is intended to get rid of half-breeds and prevent malinterference. That can only be for the good. You believe the propaganda? Snape's question echoed around the wide, cavernous corridor, but Tabitha did not reply. Instead, she put her hand close to one of the brains again. Obediently it glowed under her hand. Pray, what is to happen to half-breeds and moles under this Security Act? Tabitha turned to Snape again and shrugged. You could find out from the statutes in the lobby, she replied dismissively. Any moles caught will be befuddled and any half-breeds dealt with. The best thing we can do is distance ourselves from these creatures at a time when we are most vulnerable. As for moles, it is also for their own protection. She took a few steps back from Snape, whose face had become set as a hostile mask, and tried the next brain. It glowed, but less brightly than the other, and she removed her hand and folded her arms. For their own protection? Tell me, what does the law say will protect them? They are prevented from marrying wizards or having anything to do with our world. And half-breeds? Vampires, werewolves and the like? Imprisonment, if they come quietly. They can be locked away for our safety until they die. Tabitha's eyes widened in surprise as she realized Snape was shaking his head. Dreadful, he replied, his voice a low growl. And you, I can't believe you of all people. Your circumstances in coming to Hogwarts. You have Mole family? I do. Tabitha replied firmly. And what of my education? This isn't about me, but the wizard world as a whole. It has to be done for security. Silence reigned. It was a reasonable length of sovereignty, one that surely would have warranted an historian to write a biography of it. Upon its demise it was succeeded by pity, a short but fruitful period of influence. I feel sorry for you, Miss Penright, that you so wholeheartedly believe this. Snape looked at her, his expression making her feel disconcerted. She could deal with contempt, disdain and scorn from him, but sympathy? Tabitha rallied well and stepped towards Snape. You talk about this like you believe moles to be equal, Severus. Up to a point, we are. If that were so, then they would be admitted to Hogwarts. If not in Tabitha's body language, then her tone indicated that she thought the idea was absurd. But they are not admitted. If anything, mole schools have the right idea. They call it inclusion. And you know this because? This time it was Snape's turn to look doubtful. My family is mole. My niece and nephew go to mole schools. Though I must say, it could work at Hogwarts. She turned her attention to the brains again and looked at them distantly. She didn't see Snape's solid stance as he stared at her, wordlessly. And then he intoned, Mole children? At Hogwarts? The words came out almost as a mocking laugh, and looked to see if Tabitha was laughing too. She wasn't. When he realized this, he stopped and stared at her again. But you can't be serious. He repeated the words that he had already spoken in his head, waiting for Tabitha to let him in on the gag. They would have accessed the information, she began. And what's the point when they couldn't do magic? Snape's tone echoed down the corridor as he roared his exclamation at Tabitha. To her credit, Poodle Penright stood her ground firmly. Well, she continued, it is that they have the right, the opportunity. The point is for them to feel included. If we are to go along with your theory that moles are more equal than the ministry say they are. Obviously, if the headmaster or headmistress of the school set up practical entry, then this would eliminate most of them. She trailed off when she registered Snape's expression and waited for Snape to scoff at her stubbornness of opinion. When he didn't, it was her turn to look unconvinced. But he wasn't laughing at her idea. You would have been admitted in the first year that way. It wasn't a question, more a statement of fact. Tabitha nodded. Not that I am suggesting it because of my lot, she added. It is the only fair way, if you think about it. If moles are equal, up to a point as you said, then they should get the opportunity. Snape paused and appeared to be contemplating the notion. Then he stared at Tabitha again. And your boss, she knows about your thoughts on this matter? Tabitha Penright gave him a startled look. I'll take that as a no, then, he sneered. I would, replied Tabitha, 'cause it's the right answer. Dolores wants more exclusivity, not the other way around. My ideas would not be popular in the current political climate anyway. Look, can we forget teaching? I thought you were here to see this. She gestured along the rows of brains. They continued to walk further down the passage and Tabitha proceeded to expand on the rows of brains on display. Snape queried the quantity, feeling that there were rather more brains than possible wizards who might have wanted to bequeath their powers of cognition to the Ministry. More mysteries followed, though Tabitha did not go into great detail, continuing to talk about the mysteries until she led him along an identical-looking corridor until they reached the veiled archway. All of those are nothing compared to this, she gestured proudly. From the other side of the arch the view was almost entirely the same as from the other end. As before, Snape stared at it, almost hypnotized by its sporadic movements. It's a doorway to another place, one where mere wizards cannot go. Except you. Except me, Tabitha conceded. For everyone. For most people. It's a one-way ticket. Beyond the veil contains a soup of memories, donated ones from those famous wizards, accidental ones from unfortunates who have strayed too far, memories from fugitives who gave up their right to keep what they knew concealed. Tabitha stopped and she realized her voice had grown hard and more severe. She stepped past Snape and to the very edge of the veil before glancing over her shoulder. Something that I dare say you know who would give his right arm for. Great power, in the wrong hands. Snape said nothing but nodded slowly. So, how does this connect to the universal link? She stepped back from the veil, and smiled at Snape in the same way a mother might when her child had done something remarkable. When you return to Hogwarts, said Snape, looking down his long nose. There's no reason for me to conceal it from you any longer. Might I ask, Miss Penright, how did you do it? Tabitha didn't reply straight away. Instead she knelt at the foot of the archway, to the right of Snape and held up a cord. Too thick to be a rope, it held all the appearance of being the twine of Togo. Yes, nodded Tabitha, a little surprised at Snape's identification of the material. A true mystery indeed. Had it not been for my colleague I would not have been able to do it, but once he had solved it I knew that I could use it to go beyond. She pointed to the edge of the veil. This is where I went down. I told no one before I did it. I didn't have the time. I knew I could do it and I knew how. Taking the twine in her hand she leaned back as if to penetrate the veil itself, catching Snape's eye in the process. Tabitha stepped away and the small sag in Snape's shoulders didn't pass her by. It had been the same reaction that Gregor had displayed when she had brought him down for the first time, although it had taken the elderly wizard some persuading that she could actually return after he had put up a shield charm between her and the enticing fluttering fabric. When it came to life and death few wizards had anything less than a strong view about it. Now I know how to do it, I've been there and back. I could do it again, now. A little while later the Mysteria and the teacher made their way back towards the entrance that would take them back into Tabitha's office. Nothing was said by either of them as she led the way and Tabitha contemplated her future, which would contain rather more solvable mysteries and much fewer petulant children. The door of the office was nearly upon them and suddenly Tabitha stopped and turned to look at Snape in the dimness. Cecilia Frobisher really must be an extraordinary mole for such efforts to be made on her behalf. You have no idea, replied Snape. Her work was groundbreaking and the effects will be felt for many a coming year. He paused, Before continuing, she was declared misborn, hence a fear for her safety. Tabitha felt herself shudder, understanding what the implications of such a declaration could mean. "After you," said Tabitha, holding open the heavy-looking but as light as a feather door that led back into her office. Snape looked at it and then back to her. "Before we go, can you tell me, Miss Benwright, you've told me a good deal about the veil. How did you manage it? How do you manage it when others cannot?" Tabitha felt herself sigh, not because she didn't want to say, but because she wasn't sure how. Scrolling back in her mind to the time she had done it, and the time afterwards, she pictured what she had done and felt at the time. "Because I am a Mysteria," she began, magical things, behave differently for me. When I knew that I could do it, it was as if I already had." This time she stopped, hoping her information had been sufficient. When Snape did not move, Tabitha concluded that it was not. "Sometimes I feel I can switch it off to get it to work. I have to forget myself." "Yes," she concluded, "that's it. Like switch that I can turn off and on here." "How? How do you do it?" "You can see the past from memories, like a pensieve." Tabitha shook her head. "It's not like seeing into the future or the past. It's like seeing into the present. The way things are. From there I can interpret. So much." She jerked her head away from her gaze with Snape and looked back down the corridor. "Everything is so much clearer." Tabitha looked back at Snape. "Why? Will this help?" "What I've told you. To defeat Voldemort." Without replying, Snape pushed open the door that he had held open with his hand and looked through it, waiting for her to walk through. As Tabitha passed, Snape nodded and he followed her out into her office. "I expect I'll see you at Hogwarts." Snape spoke the words to the top of Tabitha's head. The Mysteria had sat down at her desk and was perusing the volume of Mysterious Mythology. She looked up and nodded. "In a few hours," she replied. "If you'd like to flew, you can use our fireplace. Or the one in the corridor." She looked back down, leafing over a page in the book. Striding towards the door, Snape pushed down on the door handle of the Mysteria office and took a step out, standing on the green carpet strip that lined the long corridor. He looked to the right, noting the fireplace that Tabitha Penwright had mentioned as he waited for the door to click closed behind him. Making his way up the corridor, past the aforementioned hearth and on in the direction that he and Sturgis Podmore had hurried down hours earlier, Severus Snape folded a few of the pale strands of hair over in a swiftly produced black handkerchief. 888,888,888. It was the weekend, ordinarily a time for other pursuits than work. A time when the papers have been hastily shoved higgledy-piggledy into the in-tray to be sorted on Monday, the coffee cup stumped in the sink, and the last one out of the car park was a rotten egg. For Cecilia Frobisher, however, work was about to begin. One long weekend of it. Unlike the weekend before, when Dudley had arrived home with his father on the Friday evening, this week her objectionable duty would be coming back from boarding school the next day. That suited Cecilia just fine. Her week had been busy not just preparing lessons but establishing a credible premise for an embryonic hypothesis for the cure for lycanthropy. In her mind, though, Cecilia preferred not to call it anything at all, and, when opportunity arose, she seized upon it to continue with it. Her position in the Dursley household had not changed one bit since her confrontation and eventual heart-to-heart with Petunia Dursley. Indeed, the woman of the house had continued to treat her just as she had done before, calling her by her married name and inquiring to the subjects that Dudley would be pursing at the weekend. Once or twice Cecilia thought she had caught a glimmer or two of insight to indicate the fact that they weren't the same people who had met just over 2 weeks ago. Mrs. Dursley had been true to her word and not evicted Cecilia, and Cecilia had been true to hers by continuing to tutor Dudley. In fact, Dudley would not be at Privet Drive until around lunchtime, and Cecilia had taken the chance to puzzle over the last remaining strands of her picture. She was close, she knew it. only a hair's breadth away from coalescing all that she understood scientifically about lycanthropy, and nearer still to proposing a possible solution to Remus's condition. She pretty much had her theory and had been rather shocked by her own findings, or at least to where the secondary evidence pointed. If what she thought was true, and indeed she had not explored all of the avenues or the very least asked Remus about it, then there was the possibility that a cure could be derived. A cure for Remus. Stepping away from the desk tucked away behind the door of the bedroom, Cecilia made her way across to the room's small window. She looked down at the perfectly manicured lawn that she had idly watched Mr. Dursley mow, flatten and trim the day before, and let her mind empty of worry. Her main worry had been securely sealed inside several trunks and buried at the bottom of her stomach. That consisted of her length of stay and concerns for Remus and the whole of the wizard world in general. Since she had been there she had received no correspondence or contact, and as the days had gone by doubt and concern over this had slowly been adding to her fears like coins to a money box. Her eyes followed Mrs. Dursley as she walked up the garden path and began to hang washing onto the newish-looking rotary dryer. At least she could concentrate on Remus now her ideas about Harry's potion had been sent to Severus Snape. At least she could think that the hours spent here in isolation from everything else in the wizarding world would eventually be worth something to the man she loved. Not for the first time did Cecilia wish that she could talk to Snape. She badly wanted to ask him whether he had received her letter and what he thought of her ideas. She wanted him to criticize several parts of it in his usual caustic style. In her mind Cecilia was whisked back to when they worked on the potion together in the early hours of the morning, where raw professionalism and mutual respect spurred them on. How she wished she could be with him now to talk about what seemed to be completely ludicrous, and therefore all the more likely to be true. It went like this. The moon played a vital role in the werewolf's life, controlling his actions and leaving him exposed to its will. It had something to do with the energy it bestowed upon the earth through its small, but important, gravitational force which held it in its orbit. The gravitational pull of the moon and the earth as its rock were equal, and so on the face of it the moon should have no effects whatsoever on anything on earth, but, as any fisherman could tell you, the moon does indeed have an influence, something that upon which their livelihood depended, tides. The gravitational pull of the moon caused the Earth's tides. And it was at this point in the story 2 nights before that Cecilia had had her first breakthrough. The moon at its fullest exerted the most extreme force of gravity upon the tides, producing ones that were at their highest, and conversely on the opposing coast lowest. This was the key to the nature of the werewolf, Cecilia had deduced, and therefore the key to the cure. So, what about the werewolves themselves? From the universal link work Cecilia knew, for example, that energy interacted with the DNA of the wizard to alter it, so the gravitational force caused a change in energy within the werewolf's cells. Then this would tie in. Further weight adding to this hypothesis because Lily Potter's notes detail that only magical beings, once bitten by a werewolf in its lichen form, could become werewolves themselves. Males, she noted, died after period of extreme pain. Lily referred later on to the subject of pain and that werewolves, that during certain transformations in the year they suffered extremely. That was one part of the notes that Cecilia had not understood. Lily in her teenage years had described in horrific detail the experiences of the werewolf, something Cecilia wished she had had a chance to explore, that the werewolf would experience almost unbearable torture within its body, something which could last for almost 2 hours, as if every fiber of the werewolf's body was on fire and he would lose all control of mind and body. Once this was over, the werewolf would be inclined to attack anything that was within a few hundred yards of itself, feasting on the flesh until the sun rose. The times of the year, Lily explained, was at the time of a lunar eclipse. Cecilia watched Mrs. Dursley walk back up the path towards the back door of the house, and she shivered, swallowing a nauseous wave in her stomach as she recalled reading the description. Had Remus been through this? There had been a lunar eclipse almost a month before. She had mentioned it to him and commented on the view. Sirius had been with him. Had he experienced such terrible pain and then gone on a bloody rampage? Had a young Lily Potter witnessed perhaps Remus going through such terrible things? Cecilia had gone over this in her mind the night before, pacing and contemplating as the shock set in, and now the longing to speak to Snape so he could talk to her about it turned to an ache in her chest. Pulling her mind away from the macabre images in her mind, she focused on her biological premise. As she had supposed in the past, Cecilia had returned to the idea that the lycanthropy condition was passed on parasitically, akin to malaria. It would even make sense too that the parasite would reside in the red blood cells of the werewolf because, having no nucleus and therefore no DNA, the parasite could remain for the whole of its host's life without being affected by magical spells. And now, the last bit of her theory which had taken up a considerable amount of the early hours of that morning. The part, Cecilia suspected, would have caused Snape, were he to hear it, to dismiss it until he had considered it himself, and then he would rework it until it became his own. The energy from the moon caused the parasite's reproductive cycle to be activated. On ordinary nights of a full moon the energy was enough to cause the cells to change and trigger off usual werewolf traits: howling, chasing and hunting, seeking victims. The parasites would reproduce and the condition would lie dormant in the cells until the next month. It was only when the moon was at its most influential, during the time of the lunar eclipse time, that the reproductive cycle was accelerated and increased, causing competition within the parasitic colonies, causing immense agony and pain, causing real lunacy and delirium for the time that Lily Potter had described, a time, which Cecilia noted sadly, coincided with the entire duration of a lunar eclipse. It was likely that the person they didn't transform into a werewolf until the parasites had reduced to the optimum number, before prompting vicious and widespread massacre of everything in the werewolf's path. The door below clicked closed and Cecilia looked at the blue-green swirl-patterned carpet where the dining room was. Petunia Dursley would soon be coming upstairs and calling out to her to discover whether she was up and what she wanted for breakfast. Not that Cecilia was ungrateful for Mrs. Dursley preparing her meals for her, the woman insisted and would not let her lift a finger. But it felt not a little restrictive and would have liked to have suited herself, or been able to cook for herself and Remus, back in their cottage. Back in their cottage. Cecilia looked at her bedroom door, duly locked to ward off any further accidental intrusions from Vernon Dursley in the middle of the night, and she waited for the squeak of the top step. There. Petunia Dursley had landed. It would be just 3 seconds from then until. "Miss Wells? Are you up?" 2 more steps. Then a pause. "Miss Wells?" "Good morning, Mrs. Dursley." Cecilia crept towards the door and addressed the wood. "I'll be down shortly. Then I'll put the kettle on, and cook some toast." "Okay," she added when Cecilia did not reply. "That would be lovely," she managed, hoping that Petunia Dursley wouldn't engage her long in interpine communication, as had been her way since their conversation. To her relief the top step squeaked again and Cecilia felt her heart beating quickly behind her ribs as Petunia Dursley descended. It began to slow as she heard the tap in the kitchen turned on and water filling the kettle. Turning back towards her desk, Cecilia sat upon her unmade bed and read through the 3 pages of A4 paper that she had written down all that she could surmise of the condition known as lycanthropy, holding it close to her and folding her arms. The paper crinkled as she skipped over the hypothesis again. It fitted. Or rather, from the information that she had available she had come to the most likely conclusion. Then she looked at the sheet of paper which contained a half-finished piece of writing and she picked that up too, read through it before laying it back onto the table. Hastily Cecilia flung aside the letter, for that was indeed what it was, onto her pillow and rose swiftly. Feeling for a pen, she sat in the chair from which she had paced and to which she had hurried many times during the previous night, as she had added, crossed out, amended and inserted words before writing what she had just discarded. Now Cecilia continued to write the partner to the first, its spouse, without whom the first would be entirely without purpose. And within a few minutes she had hastily finished before uniting them in envelopic matrimony. Downstairs a few plates yielded to gravity as Petunia Dursley laid out the breakfast table, and Cecilia got back up and stretched her legs. Done. All her work, the culmination of all the knowledge and understanding of lycanthropy, of science, of the nature of wizards and of magic, condensed into an hypothesis. And a cure. Of sorts. It had been strange how it had all come together. Like her theory about the mole-wizard connection, more commonly known as the universal link, it hadn't come about evenly. Bits and pieces would come together, like the isolated features of the picture of a jigsaw puzzle within the straight-edged frame. Other sections had grown in isolation before interconnecting pieces, like embracing arms, encompassed isolated islands of pieces until, before she knew it, she could see the glorious whole. That was, if all the pieces were for the right puzzle, and if, to make it accurate, all of the pieces were the